The report arrived on Raymond Kelleher's desk on a Tuesday morning in March 1967, buried inside a stack of Third Corps intelligence summaries that he processed the way a man processes mail, quickly, skeptically, with the practiced eye of someone who had been lied to professionally for 11 years. Kelleher was 34 years old. He held a master's degree in strategic analysis from Johns Hopkins and had spent the previous 3 years in Saigon as a senior intelligence analyst attached to MACV's Combined Intelligence Center Vietnam, known internally as CICV. His job was to assess the accuracy of combat reporting from Allied units operating in 3rd and 4th Corps. He read kill claims the way a bank examiner reads ledgers, looking for the places where the numbers didn't add up. They almost always didn't add up. The South Vietnamese Army reported kill ratios that were, in Kelleher's private assessment, mathematically impossible given their tactical situation, their equipment, and the consistent evidence from captured enemy documents that contradicted the claimed body counts. American units were more honest but still optimistic. The kill ratio inflation was institutional, structural, and so deeply embedded in the reporting culture that Kelleher had stopped being surprised by it. What was in the March report surprised him. The document was a quarterly summary of 1st Australian Task Force operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. The Australians had been operating in their assigned province since May 1966. The province was, by any reasonable assessment, a difficult operational environment, dense jungle, an established Viet Cong infrastructure, and the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, a locally recruited unit that knew the terrain better than anyone. The kill ratios in the Australian report were not inflated. They were impossible. Kelleher read the summary twice. Then he pulled the individual after-action reports that fed into it. Then he cross-referenced them against MACV's independent body count verification procedures. The numbers hound. The 1st Australian Task Force reported 638 confirmed enemy killed in the period July 1966 through February 1967. Against that figure, they had suffered 49 killed in action, a ratio of 13-1. In the mathematics of Vietnam, where American units were celebrating ratios of 3-1, where 5-1 was considered exceptional, 13-1 was not a military achievement. It was a clerical error. Kelleher wrote a single line in his assessment notebook. Numbers require source verification. Probable reporting inflation at battalion level. He flagged the report and moved on. Raymond Kelleher had not arrived at his skepticism accidentally. He had come to Vietnam in January 1964, when the American presence was still officially advisory, and the fiction of non-involvement was still being maintained with something approaching conviction. He had watched the fiction dissolve, had watched the reporting culture develop in real time, had watched the pressure that flowed downward from commanders who needed results, who needed the numbers to justify the investment, who needed the kill ratios to tell a story of progress to Washington. The pressure distorted everything it touched. A platoon leader who reported 3 enemy killed when his men claimed 8 was not being honest. He was being career-limiting. The pressure was not explicit. No one issued a memorandum instructing units to inflate their body counts. The pressure was cultural, gravitational, the natural consequence of a system that measured success in enemy deaths and rewarded the units that reported the most of them. Kelleher had documented this. He had written internal assessments that were read, acknowledged, and filed. He had raised the issue with his superiors at CICV. He had been told, politely but clearly, that his job was to assess the numbers that were given to him, not to investigate the culture that produced them. So he assessed the numbers. He became very good at identifying the patterns of inflation, The slightly too round body counts, the kill ratios that exceeded the physical capacity of the unit to have achieved them, the enemy casualties that appeared in reports with no corresponding intelligence on enemy movements. He had never in 3 years encountered numbers that looked too low. The Australian numbers looked too low. Not because they were modest. 638 confirmed kills was not a modest number for a force the size of the 1st ATF, but because the methodology they described was too slow, too patient, too intelligence-driven to have produced results at that scale with those casualties. The Australians were claiming they had achieved their results through careful patrolling, intelligence preparation, and ambush operations planned from detailed reconnaissance. They were claiming, in essence, that they had been more careful than any Allied unit in Vietnam. Careful units didn't get 13-1. Careful units survived. They didn't dominate. Kelleher believed one of two things was true. Either the Australians were lying about their methodology, claiming careful patrolling while actually conducting aggressive search and destroy operations that their reporting culture was simply more honest about, or they were fabricating the results while accurately describing the methodology. Both explanations required the numbers to be wrong. He filed his assessment. Recommend independent verification of 1 ATF kill ratio data. Probable discrepancy between reported methodology and reported results. Request field assessment team be authorized for Phuoc Tuy province. The recommendation sat in his out tray for 11 days. Then his section chief called him in. MACV wants to know what you think is wrong with the Australian numbers. I think they're inflated, Kelleher said. By how much? Significantly. The ratios are inconsistent with their described operational methodology. His section chief looked at him for a moment. The Australians have offered to host an observer from CICV. Full access to their operational planning, their intelligence product, their after-action reports. Unrestricted. Kelleher understood immediately what this meant. The Australians had heard about the flag. They were calling his bluff. When? He said. 2 weeks. He said he would go. Kelleher arrived at Nui Dat on April 4, 1967, aboard a RAAF UH-1B helicopter from Vung Tau. He carried a briefcase containing the March quarterly report, his own assessment notes, and a legal pad on which he had written, the night before departure, a list of 14 specific questions he intended to have answered. The first question was the simplest. Where are the bodies? If the Australians had killed 638 enemy soldiers in 8 months, there should be physical evidence. Captured weapons, captured equipment, medical records showing the treatment of Australian soldiers wounded in engagements significant enough to produce those kinds of enemy casualties. Documents recovered from enemy dead that could be cross-referenced against known D445 unit rosters. If the evidence existed, the numbers were real. If it didn't, he would know. The officer who met him at the landing pad was not the commander he had expected. He had anticipated a colonel or, at minimum, a lieutenant colonel, the kind of senior officer who manages visitors, who controls the narrative, who presents the institution at its best angle. Instead, he got a captain named David Morrow, 26 years old, intelligence officer for the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. Morrow shook his hand. Mr. Kelleher, good flight? Adequate, Kelleher said. We've set you up in the intelligence section. You'll have access to everything. Patrol reports, contact reports, intelligence summaries, prisoner interrogation records. If there's something specific you want to look at, tell me, and I'll pull it. I want to start with the contact reports, Kelleher said. Every confirmed kill in the period July through February. Individual reports, not the summary. They're already on the table, Morrow said. This was not what Kelleher had expected either. He spent the first 2 days reading.
The contact reports were not what he was accustomed to. American after-action reports followed a standard format: time, location, units involved, friendly casualties, enemy casualties, weapons captured. The numbers appeared at the top. The narrative came second, if it came at all. The Australian reports reversed this structure. The narrative came first. It was detailed, specific, and written in a style that Kelleher could only describe as methodical. Each report described the intelligence preparation that preceded the contact: the patrol reports, the signals intelligence, the information from I-band trackers that identified the enemy's likely route or position. Then it described the movement to contact: exactly how far the patrol moved, how long it took, what they saw. Then the contact itself: duration in seconds, weapons employed, rounds fired, positions of each patrol member. The enemy casualties appeared last. They were described precisely: confirmed kills observed by the patrol, estimated kills based on blood trails, captured weapons that could be individually documented by serial number where readable. Kelleher found the first anomaly on the afternoon of the second day. The report described a patrol contact on September 14, 1966, in which an Australian patrol of 6 men had ambushed a Viet Cong resupply party of 14. The patrol reported 7 confirmed enemy killed and 3 probable. Weapons captured included 4 AK-47s, 2 SKS carbines, and 1 RPD light machine gun. The anomaly was the weapons. 7 confirmed kills. 7 individual enemy soldiers observed dead on the ground.
But only 6 weapons captured: 1 RPD, 4 AK-47s, 1 SKS. A 7th weapon should have been there. Unless one of the confirmed kills was an unarmed resupply porter, in which case the patrol had been specific enough to note the absence of a weapon on a man they had counted among the enemy dead. Kelleher had never seen that in an American report. He found a similar detail in a contact report from November. A patrol that had ambushed a Viet Cong reconnaissance unit reported 4 confirmed kills and 2 probables. The probables were described precisely: blood trail of significant volume leading northeast for approximately 80 meters before reaching the bank of a stream, after which no further blood trace was found, suggesting the wounded soldiers had entered the water. The patrol had not pursued. They had noted the evidence and withdrawn. 2 probable kills, reported as probable, not confirmed. Kelleher had processed thousands of American reports in which casualties with far less supporting evidence appeared as confirmed. He called Morrow over. "These probable kills, your patrols are conservative in what they count." "Yes," Morrow said. "Why?" Morrow looked at him as if the question required explanation only because the asker had never considered its absence. "Because if we inflate the count, the intelligence picture gets distorted. If we claim kills we can't confirm, we start thinking we've degraded the enemy more than we have. Then we plan operations based on a strength estimate that's wrong, and men die." Morrow set down his tea. "The reporting standard isn't for MACV. It's for us." Kelleher wrote this down. On the 3rd day, Morrow took him to see the intelligence product. The SAS squadron's intelligence section was housed in a building that Kelleher would have described, charitably, as functional. A series of maps covered one wall, each annotated with a precision that startled him. Not just the standard unit positions and patrol routes. The maps showed individual trail networks, river crossing points, water sources, longhouse locations, the agricultural patterns of villages near the border. Every piece of information that determined how the enemy moved and where they could be found. The intelligence officer responsible for the maps was a sergeant named Frank Aldridge. He was 23 years old. He had the maps memorized. Kelleher stood in front of the primary operational map for a long time. How current is this? The trail network in grid 4731 was updated 4 days ago, Aldrich said. Patrol came back with fresh information on a secondary route we hadn't confirmed. And this? Kelleher pointed to a cluster of annotations in the eastern section of the province. Numbers, arrows, dates. Supply movement pattern for the D445's third company, Aldrich said. Based on 14 patrols over a 3-month period. We've established their resupply cycle, 12 to 15 days between major movements. Primary route runs along the Soi Sa River, secondary route through the jungle east of Long Phuc. They alternate. We've been sitting on the primary for the last 2 rotations, so they're due to use the secondary. When? 3 to 5 days? Kelleher looked at the map. You're predicting enemy movement patterns. Yes. Based on behavioral observation. Based on patrol intelligence, signals intercepts, and prisoner interrogation. Cross-referenced. Kelleher had spent 3 years at MACV evaluating intelligence products from across the theater. He had read assessments from American units with full signals intelligence apparatus, with aerial reconnaissance, with agent networks. He had not seen a provincial-level intelligence picture this detailed, this granular, or this current from any of them. Who built this? He asked. Aldrich looked at him steadily. We did. Kelleher wrote in his notebook, intelligence architecture significantly more sophisticated than anything in comparable AO. Request comparison with MACV provincial assessments. He underlined the word significantly. Morrow arranged for Kelleher to sit in on a patrol debrief on the 5th day. A 4-man SAS patrol had returned from a 72-hour reconnaissance operation in the jungle northeast of the village of Long Khan. They were dirty, thin, and completely composed. The debrief was conducted by Aldrich, who sat across a table from the patrol leader, a corporal named Raymond Sayers, and worked through a handwritten patrol log with the systematic attention of an auditor. Kelleher sat against the wall and said nothing. Contact with enemy on day 2, Aldrich said. Time? 14:23 hours, Sayers said. Duration? 14 seconds. Weapons employed by patrol? 2L1A1, 1M79, 3 rounds M79, approximately 40 rounds 7.62 from the SLRs. Enemy casualties confirmed? 3. Observed at the time of contact. Checked on withdrawal. Confirmed dead. Weapons recovered? 2 AK-47s. Both have serial numbers. I photographed them. Sayers slid a small notebook across the table. Third man was unarmed. Appeared to be a courier. He was carrying a document bag. Where's the bag? Sayers produced a waterproof pouch from his pack. Inside were 4 folded documents, dirt-stained, in Vietnamese. Kelleher leaned forward involuntarily. Aldrich opened the documents carefully. He could read Vietnamese. Kelleher would learn this later, that the SAS intelligence section had invested in language training that most American units had not considered necessary. Aldrich scanned the first document. His expression did not change. Movement order, he said. D445, 3rd Company, dated 3 days ago. Route specified. He looked up at Sayers. This confirms the secondary route. They moved early. I know, Sayers said. We were on the wrong side of the river. There was a silence in the room, not a disappointed silence. The silence of professionals absorbing new information and updating their models. We'll adjust, Aldrich said. He made a note. The debrief continued. Kelleher sat against the wall and thought about his 14 questions. He had brought them from Saigon as the framework of a verification exercise. He had expected to find gaps between the reported results and the supporting evidence. He had expected the kind of narrative looseness that allowed good faith inflation, The situation where a patrol killed 3 and a staff officer wrote 5, not from malice but from the accumulated pressure of a system that rewarded higher numbers. He was finding the opposite. The system he was observing actively resisted inflation. It was built around the principle that inaccurate intelligence was more dangerous than disappointing intelligence. Every number in every report was supported by the specific evidence that produced it. Where evidence was absent, the number was absent. He had one remaining question from his original 14 that he had not yet been able to answer. Why are they doing it this way when the system doesn't require it? He asked Morrow on the 6th day. They were sitting outside the intelligence section in the late afternoon, the heat beginning to ease as the sun dropped toward the jungle. Morrow was drinking tea. Kelleher was on his 3rd coffee of the day, a habit that the Australian ration supply could not adequately support. "Your reporting standards are higher than MACV requires," Kelleher said. "You could report your numbers with significantly less documentation, and no one would question it. So why do you report this way?" Morrow thought about it. "Because the intelligence matters more than the numbers." Kelleher waited. "If we inflate the count, we're essentially lying to ourselves. We start to think the D445 is weaker than it is. We start to plan on the assumption that we've degraded them more than we have. And then we send a patrol into an area where we think there are 30 enemy, and there are actually 60. And men don't come back." Morrow set down his tea. "The reporting standard isn't for MACV. It's for us." Kelleher wrote this down. He also wrote, "This is the answer to the anomaly. The numbers are low because the evidence threshold is high. The ratios are real because the methodology produces real results. Recommend full reassessment." He had arrived in Phúc Tuy province to verify a suspicion that the Australian numbers were fabricated. He was leaving with the conclusion that they were understated. The verification of this conclusion came not from the Australian records, but from the enemy's. On the 8th day of Kelleher's visit, the documents recovered by Sayer's patrol were translated in full. The movement order was what Aldrich had identified, a routine administrative document directing D445's 3rd Company along a specified route on a specified date. But the 4th document in the pouch was something else. It was an after-action report, written by a D445 company commander, addressed to the battalion headquarters, dated 6 weeks earlier. It described, in the clinical language of a military bureaucracy, an engagement in which a company strength patrol had been ambushed by an unknown force on a trail in the eastern sector of the province. The company had lost 11 men confirmed killed and 4 wounded. The enemy force had not been identified. No shell casings, no boot prints, no equipment, no evidence of any kind had been recovered from the ambush site. The company commander had estimated the attacking force at platoon strength based on the volume of fire. He had requested reinforcement and a change to the company's patrol routes. Kelleher cross-referenced the date and location against the Australian contact reports. The engagement matched a patrol led by a staff sergeant named Collins on January 23, 1967. The Australian report recorded 4 confirmed enemy killed and 3 probable. Total patrol strength, 6 men. Duration of engagement, 9 seconds. The D445 commander had lost 11 confirmed dead to 6 Australians in 9 seconds and had estimated the attacking force at platoon strength. The Australians had reported 4 confirmed kills and 3 probable. The enemy's own records showed 11 dead. Kelleher sat with this for a long time. The discrepancy ran in one direction only. The Australian count was not inflated. It was conservative, constrained by what the patrol could directly observe and confirm in 9 seconds of contact
before withdrawing. The enemy's own body count exceeded the Australian claimed figure by a factor of almost 3. If this pattern held across the operation, if the Australian confirmed kills were consistently running at roughly 1/3 of actual enemy casualties, then the true ratio was not 13-1. It was closer to 40-1. Kelleher flew back to Saigon on April 14th. He had been in Phuoc Tuy province for 10 days. He carried with him photocopies of 23 separate contact reports, 4 intelligence assessments, 2 prisoner interrogation summaries, and the translated D445 document. He also carried his legal pad with the 14 questions. 12 of them had been answered in ways that contradicted his original assessment. 2 of them, the questions about the intelligence architecture and the reporting culture, had been answered in ways he had not anticipated when he wrote them. He had also been given, at his request, a copy of the SAS patrol methodology document, a 12-page internal guide that described how reconnaissance patrols were planned, conducted, and debriefed. It had been prepared by the SAS Squadron Intelligence Section and was classified Australian Eyes Only. The squadron commander had authorized its release to Kelleher after what appeared to be a brief internal discussion.
The document was not marked for external distribution. Kelleher read it on the helicopter back to Vung Tau. It described a system of intelligence-led operations that was, in his professional assessment, more sophisticated than the equivalent doctrine in use by any American unit he had encountered. The emphasis on intelligence preparation before contact, the insistence on accurate reporting over favorable reporting, the understanding that the intelligence picture was a living document that required constant updating, and that any inaccuracy introduced into it through inflated reporting would eventually manifest as a tactical failure. It was, in Kelleher's assessment, the answer to the question that had been troubling him since he first read the March quarterly report. Not, how did they get numbers this good? But, how did they build a system that made numbers this good inevitable? The briefing at CICV took place on April 17, 1967. Kelleher presented his findings to a room of 11 people, including his section chief, 2 senior analysts from the Vietnam Order of Battle section, a representative from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and a colonel from MACVJ-2 who had been specifically requested to attend. Kelleher had prepared a 9-page written assessment. He had also prepared a single summary slide, which he presented first. It read, "Assessment of 1ATF kill ratio data. Verified, accurate. Evidence suggests reported figures may understate actual enemy casualties by a factor of 2 to 3. The room was quiet. The MACV colonel spoke first. "You're saying the Australians are underreporting kills? I'm saying their verification standard is higher than MACV's standard reporting requirement, which means they're only counting what they can directly confirm. Enemy after-action documentation recovered during my visit suggests actual casualties significantly exceed confirmed figures." "What's the actual ratio you're estimating?" "Based on the documentary evidence available to me, something between 25 and 40-1. Another silence. "That's not a kill ratio," one of the DIA analysts said. "That's a massacre statistic." "It's a patrol statistic," Kelleher said. "Small units, excellent intelligence preparation, very short contact engagements. They're not fighting the enemy. They're ambushing them. There's a difference." He had not planned to say this. It was not in the 9-page assessment, but it was what 11 days in Phuoc Tuy province had shown him, and he was constitutionally unable to present a conclusion without stating the logic that produced it. "The enemy doesn't know where they are," he continued. "The Australians have built an intelligence picture of the province that allows them to predict enemy movement. They position on the route before the enemy arrives. The engagement lasts between 9 and 17 seconds. Then they withdraw. They leave no trace. The enemy reports contact with a large force because the speed and precision of the ambush is inconsistent with small unit action. He paused. I went to Footnote to find out why their numbers were wrong. I'm telling you the numbers are correct, and that we should be studying how they're doing it. The MACV colonel said he would take the assessment under advisement. The briefing ended. Kelleher's 9-page report was classified, distributed to a list of 8 recipients within MACV and the intelligence community, and formally acknowledged by 2 of them. The acknowledgement was bureaucratic, confirmation of receipt, not engagement with the content. He wrote a follow-up recommendation 3 weeks later, requesting that a formal study be commissioned comparing Australian and American patrol methodology in comparable operational environments. The recommendation was acknowledged. No study was commissioned. In June 1967, Kelleher was reassigned from the Vietnam Order of Battle section to a different analytical function within CICV that had nothing to do with kill ratio assessment. He did not believe the reassignment was punitive. He believed it was simply institutional. The system processing something that didn't fit its framework by moving the element that had introduced the incompatibility. This was how large bureaucracies handled inconvenient data. He went on to a distinguished career in the intelligence community. He spent 4 years at the DIA, 2 years as a senior analyst at Langley, and a final posting as station chief in a country that he was not permitted to name in the memoir he eventually wrote, which was published in 2003 and contained a chapter, 17 pages, on his time in Vietnam. The chapter described Phuoc Tuy province. It described the intelligence maps, the patrol methodology, the debrief he had observed, the D445 document. It described the briefing at CICV and the room's response to his summary slide. It did not name the captain, the sergeant, the corporal, or any of the Australians he had encountered. He had asked for permission to use their names and had been told that some of them had gone on to sensitive postings and that attribution was inadvisable. He respected this. The chapter concluded with a paragraph that would be quoted partially in 2 subsequent academic works on the Vietnam intelligence failure, neither of which was specifically about Australian operations. I arrived in Phuoc Tuy province prepared to document a failure of reporting integrity. What I documented instead was a failure of institutional imagination. Our inability to recognize excellence when it didn't look like what we expected excellence to look like. The Australians were not doing anything we couldn't have done. They were doing what we had decided at some point was unnecessary. The decision cost us more than we ever calculated. The SAS methodology that Kelleher had observed in Phuoc Tuy province did not disappear with the end of the Vietnam War. It was transmitted in the imprecise and unacknowledged way that effective practice moves through military institutions, through the officers and NCOs who had served alongside Australian forces and had carried what they learned back to their own units. It appeared in the doctrine revisions of the late 1970s that reshaped American Special Operations training. It appeared in the emphasis on intelligence preparation of the battlefield that became central to SOCOM's operational philosophy in the 1980s. It appeared in the patrol methodology taught at the Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, where it was attributed, accurately, to operational experience in Vietnam and, inaccurately, to no one in particular. The 12-page SAS patrol methodology document that had been given to Kelleher in April 1967 was not the source of these changes. The source was the behavior it described, the accumulated practice of dozens of patrols conducted by men whose names were never attached to the doctrine they generated. Kelleher knew this. He wrote about it in the 2003 memoir, and in a shorter piece he contributed to an intelligence community journal in 2009, 2 years before his death. He was precise about the limitation of his own knowledge. He could trace the influence to Phuoc Tuy province and to the general period of the late 1960s, but he could not trace it to specific individuals because the specific individuals had declined to be traced. This was, he wrote, entirely consistent with everything he had observed about them. The D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion continued operating in Phuoc Tuy province until the end of the Australian presence in Vietnam. Post-war Vietnamese military histories, declassified and translated in the late 1990s, assessed the D445's operational effectiveness in Phuoc Tuy as significantly degraded from mid-1966 onward. The Vietnamese assessment attributed this degradation to Australian intelligence-driven operations and specifically noted the anomalous nature of Australian patrol behavior, the brevity of contacts, the absence of pursuit, the inability to locate Australian patrol bases despite sustained reconnaissance efforts. One Vietnamese regimental history, published in Hanoi in 1988 and translated by the Australian War Memorial in 1997, described the D445's experience in Phuoc Tuy in terms that Kelleher, had he read it, would have recognized immediately. The Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy operated in a manner unlike any other enemy unit encountered during the resistance. They could not be found when sought and could not be avoided when they chose to strike. Our assessment of their strength was consistently overestimated because the evidence of their presence exceeded the evidence of their numbers. We never established with confidence how many soldiers they had in the province. The Australians had 4,500 troops in Phuoc Tuy province. The Vietnamese had spent years trying to count them and had concluded there were more. Raymond Kelleher's summary slide, verified accurate. Evidence suggests reported figures may understate actual enemy casualties by a factor of 2 to 3, was filed in the CICV archive and remained classified until 1993. When it was declassified as part of a broader review of Vietnam-era intelligence records, it generated a small amount of scholarly attention. One military historian cited it in a 1996 article on intelligence assessment methodology. The citation was accurate. The article did not name the Australians whose operations the slide was about. The men themselves were by then retired, dispersed, or dead. The sergeant who had briefed Kelleher on the intelligence maps, Frank Aldridge, had left the Army in 1971 and spent the following 30 years managing a hardware business in Townsville, Queensland. He was interviewed once in 2001 by a researcher from the Australian War Memorial working on an oral history project. The interview lasted 90 minutes and covered his service in Vietnam in general terms. When the researcher asked about his intelligence work, Aldridge said it was the job. When the researcher asked whether he thought the Australian methodology had influenced subsequent doctrine, he said he didn't know and hadn't thought about it. He was probably telling the truth. The corporal who had recovered the D445 documents, Raymond Sayers, was killed in action on June 4, 1967. 7 weeks after Kelleher had watched him deliver a debrief with the composure of someone describing an uneventful Tuesday. He was 24 years old. His service record notes the patrol on which he was killed. It does not mention the debrief Kelleher observed, or the documents he recovered, or the D445 after-action report that had provided the most concrete evidence that the Australian numbers were not only accurate, but conservative. That information is in Kelleher's 9-page report, which is in the CICV archive, which is in the National Archives, which is in College Park, Maryland. It is available to anyone who requests it. Almost no one has. The kill ratio question, the question that had brought Kelleher to Phuoc Tuy in the first place, was eventually settled by the post-war assessment of enemy records. The Vietnamese People's Army Historical Commission's accounting of D445 casualties in Phuoc Tuy Province during the Australian operational period, cross-referenced against Australian confirmed kills, produced a ratio that fell within Kelleher's estimated range. The number was not published as a headline. It appeared in an academic monograph on the Vietnam War's provincial campaigns, published in 2004, in a footnote on page 247. The footnote read, Vietnamese military records indicate D445 casualties in Phuoc Tuy significantly exceeded Australian reported figures for the operational period, 1966 to 1971. The discrepancy is consistent with Australian reporting standards, which required direct observation for casualty confirmation. The monograph sold 2,300 copies. No one made a documentary about it. The techniques the Australians had used, the intelligence preparation, the patience, the 9-second ambushes, the conservative reporting that made the operation more effective by making the intelligence more accurate, those techniques were still being taught. Not in Australia specifically, in various training programs in various countries, adapted and renamed and attributed to operational experience in various theaters. The attribution was accurate. The lineage was not. The men who had built the methodology in the jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province, who had counted their kills conservatively and their intelligence obsessively, who had built a picture of the province so detailed that they could predict enemy movement patterns 3 days in advance, those men were not in the training manuals. They were in a footnote on page 247 of a book that 2,300 people had read. That was, in its way, exactly right. The Australians had not been trying to be in the training manuals. They had been trying to bring their men home. The discipline and the methodology and the conservative reporting were not performances of professionalism. They were the operational expression of a simple calculation. Accurate intelligence saves lives. Everything else, the ratios, the recognition, the history, was administrative. Raymond Sayers understood this. He demonstrated it in a 90-minute patrol debrief that a CIA analyst watched from against a wall in a building in Nui Dat in April 1967. He was dead 7 weeks later. The documents he recovered from a courier's bag on a trail northeast of Long Khan are in the Australian War Memorial Archive in Canberra. They have been viewed 11 times since their declassification in 1994.